So I think at this point we know the UFC picks their favorites. They have certain fighters on the roster who they favor over others. And not only that, they make sure they push these guys to the moon by giving them favorable matchups and just easy ways to get towards the top of their division. And I've said this numerous times. You can go back and look through all of my videos. I've even made predictions around this quote. The UFC always gets what they want. Whether that's for a prospect who they want to win their debut, or it's a champion who they want to lose because the challenger offers them more money in the long run. So I thought of a great idea for this video. What if we let the UFC get what they want and we can't do a damn thing about it? What if every single UFC champion right now in every division was handpicked by the UFC? They just placed them purposely as a champion and we couldn't say a damn thing about it. That is what I decided to make for this video. What if the UFC could appoint anybody they wanted to as a champion of every single division? So I'm going to go through the list of champions in every single weight class and give you the UFC's alternative if they could make that person champion. So here we go. Let's get right into this. You might see the black screen right next to me. Don't worry, I'm going to uncover who the UFC wants to be champion at flyweight in just a second. But just to be clear, I'm going to go through every single weight class and reveal them one by one. But we start off with flyweight, and I believe the UFC, if they could pick anybody to be the champion at flyweight, I think it would be Tatsuro Taira. There's not many fighters at flyweight right now who I think the UFC would prefer over one another, but I think with the recent signing of Kai Asakura, I believe Tatsuro Taira would be the best way for the UFC to get into that Japanese market. And it's really just that simple. I don't think they would really necessarily care about Taira that much, but I think since they're trying to expand and get into that Asian market, specifically Japan, I think they want to have more Japanese fighters at the top of their divisions. And the way they can do that is by pushing Kai Asakura, by pushing Tatsuro Taira, and getting more fighters from Japan, from Asia, and getting them over to the UFC and pushing them towards the top of their division. Even in the past, we've seen the UFC have a promotion called Road to UFC where they had a bunch of Asian fighters. It's pretty clear they want to compete with one championship and have a lot of Asian fighters on their roster. But right now, there just really isn't enough for them to have a foothold in the Asian market. So the best way for them to do that is by pushing these guys and promote all of these guys from one championship, or promote all of these guys who are on the regional scene in these Asian countries to want to make the move over to the UFC rather than one championship. And I think the best way for the UFC to do that is by putting all of their faith into Tatsuro Taira to be a good champion. So I think right now, if they could appoint anybody to be champion at flyweight, it would be Tatsuro Taira, just for the fact that they can get into that Asian market. There's not really any other outside reasoning besides that. Maybe you can say a Manel Kape because he does have some level of mic skills and he's a pretty entertaining fighter. But I think in the long run and when it comes to marketing, getting Tatsuro Taira to the top and making him a champion should be the UFC's #1 priority if they want to expand and make more money from that Asian market. But we move on to bantamweight, and that still is Sean O'Malley. And you might see a little reoccurring theme here in these videos because a lot of these champions right now in the UFC are who the UFC want to be champions. So maybe I'm not wrong with the whole quote saying the UFC always gets what they want, because guess what? They do. They've improved that to us by having some of these champions win, like a Sean O'Malley. The UFC loves Sean O'Malley. He's a great star for them to have at the top of bantamweight, and him being the champion is pretty much all they could ask for. We've seen the UFC kind of really take their time and try to protect Sean O'Malley when it came to his matchups in the UFC. When he was on his second initial run, technically, because he did pop for roids and have that 2-year ban. So I guess his current run is his second run in the UFC. But after his 2-year suspension from the UFC, we saw them really protect him and make sure he got a pretty easy way to the top of bantamweight. He fought Raulian Paiva. He fought an old Eddie Wineland. They gave him Chito Vera, expecting him to win that matchup, but it backfired on him. They gave him #1 ranked Petr Yan when he was only ranked like number 13 at the time. They were really trying to protect and push Sean O'Malley to get that belt. They made Aljamain Sterling make a quick turnaround to fight him for the belt, in which Sean O'Malley won by first or second round TKO. So it's really no surprise the UFC has put all of their chips on the table for Sean O'Malley being champion. And I think they still would want him to be champion right now. I don't see any other bantamweight who can outshine Sean O'Malley right now. I think it's pretty clear the UFC does not want Merab to be the next champion at bantamweight. And the same thing can be said for Corey Sandhagen. So I think it's pretty clear the UFC wants Sean O'Malley to be champion. And if the whole UFC had a sudden reset where they got to handpick all the champions, I still think they would make Sean O'Malley the champion of bantamweight. But we move on to featherweight, and I think it's the same deal. Topuria. Again, it's the whole market thing. They want this Spanish market. They want this Eastern European market with the Georgians. They want a market in Europe. And when it comes to Ilia Topuria, he fits that bill. He's also an exciting fighter. He gets one-punch KOs. He's the total package when it comes to the UFC. He is their perfect guy. He even speaks good English for the most part. Now, honestly, the only difference between Topuria and O'Malley is that they really didn't give Topuria all of that much protection while he was rising up the rankings like a Sean O'Malley. They kind of just gave him typical matchups like any other fighter would get. They didn't really take their time with him, but I think once they saw how good he really was and the potential they had in Ilia Topuria, they realized, okay, this guy can get us a main event or a fight night in Spain or a pay-per-view card in Spain. This guy can branch out our market. We need to get more of a foothold into the European market. So let's go ahead and push this guy and give him Volk. Now, at that time, they had to give Volk Topuria because there was no other contender, but I think the UFC was pretty much content with either having Volk or Topuria at the top of featherweight. They didn't really mind. Volk was kind of getting old, kind of aging in his career. So I think it was time for them to move on for Volk if the UFC had a choice, by the way. But I think in that matchup between Topuria and Volk, who they were rooting for, I think was Topuria. So it's kind of a similar deal between Tatsuro Taira and Ilia Topuria. It's a market thing. The UFC wants to expand their market to be worldwide. They want to get as much talent as possible in from other countries while leaving very few for the other promotions like a Bellator, PFL, One Championship. The more talent they bring in, the more of a market they have, the more of a foothold they have in other countries, the better chances they can monopolize and prioritize their own brand over others. But we move on to lightweight. This one, in my opinion, I think is very, very easy. The UFC is pretty content with having Islam Makhachev at the top of lightweight being their champion, but there's always that one guy, and we know who that guy is. He brings in the most money to the UFC. He brings in the most value. He is the biggest name in all of combat sports. That is Conor McGregor. If the UFC can make anybody champion at lightweight, it would be Conor McGregor. Now, how do they get there? I don't know, but guess what? In this whole hypothetical situation, we're saying the UFC can appoint anybody as a champion of a division, and I can almost guarantee you they would appoint Conor McGregor as a champion of lightweight. If they could get away with this, if nobody could say a thing, if we couldn't complain, if we were shut off, if we were all robots in a fictional world, they would make Conor McGregor champion in an instant. No hesitation, no second thought about it. They would make Conor McGregor champion. He is the biggest name of all combat sports. Again, there's just no refute you can have in regards to this. This guy brings in millions and millions and millions of dollars to the UFC. One pay-per-view sells over $1 million. Nobody can really do that besides Conor McGregor in the UFC right now. Nobody can even come close to 1 million pay-per-views besides Conor McGregor. And I like Islam. The UFC likes Islam as well. But when it comes to money, money talks. And Conor McGregor, all he talks is money. His whole language is money. So if the UFC could just pick anybody to be champion at lightweight, it without a doubt would be Conor McGregor. But we move on to welterweight. And now with this one, I don't really think the UFC has anybody in mind. I don't think they necessarily care too much about whoever is champion at the top of welterweight. But if I had to pick anybody, I think it would be Shavkat. I think it's his whole name, his whole brand. He's undefeated, has won, I think, every fight so far in the UFC by finish. I think he's on like an 18-fight win streak by finish. Again, his name is Shavkat Rakhmonov. I know he is from Kazakhstan, but he still has that whole Western and Eastern Asian market in his whole grasp right now. He's a pretty dangerous guy as well. He is the real deal at welterweight. I'll say this. Is he the most promotable guy at welterweight? No. But is there really anybody else besides Leon Edwards who they want to be champion? Other than Leon, that's really it. And I think the UFC already has a pretty good foothold in the UK. So I don't really see the market argument for Leon to still be champion. So besides that, it's pretty much going to have to be Shavkat here. Bilal is completely unmarketable. He gets every win by decision. He doesn't get any finishes, so they can't really put all of their trust into Bilal. Khamzat Chimaev has moved up to middleweight, so he's gone from the welterweight division. There really is no clear-cut name who the UFC wants to be champion at welterweight. Maybe Ian Gary can be a name, but Ian Gary's name right now is more negative than positive. He still can bring in some attention, but I don't think Ian Gary is doing the best with what he has right now. So if I had to put a bet on it, I probably would take Shavkat to be the UFC's little hand-picked boy to be the champion if they could make anybody champion. But we move on to middleweight, and this one I think is also pretty easy. Similar to Conor McGregor, it is Israel Adesanya. It's the same deal. Israel Adesanya brings in the most money at middleweight right now. Nobody besides, maybe you can argue a Sean Strickland does bring in a similar level of money than Adesanya, but Adesanya has done it for so long now. He definitely still is a bigger name than Sean Strickland. I still think he brings in more money than Sean Strickland. Maybe his fight style isn't the most entertaining in these past few fights that he's had, besides maybe the Pereira rematch, but other than that, Adesanya is the biggest name and one of the biggest names in the entirety of the UFC. They want him to be champion. It's pretty apparent now since they made him versus DDP. Even after the last fight Adesanya has had in the UFC, he lost by dominant decision versus Sean Strickland, and they're giving him an automatic rematch. So it's pretty clear the UFC still wants to put all of their faith behind Adesanya. So I don't really see anybody else being able to take his place at middleweight. Dricus is fun. He's a good name, but he's not as big as Adesanya. Whitaker is fun. He's a good name, but he's not as big as Adesanya. Strickland's a fun name. He's a great fighter, but he's just not as big as Adesanya. And that's pretty much the whole case when it comes to middleweight. The UFC defends Adesanya. They wanted him to be great. They wanted him to be double champion. They wanted him to beat Jan Blachowicz. The whole commentary team was giving him the glaze of a lifetime whenever he fought Jan Blachowicz. So it's pretty apparent the UFC is probably telling some of the commentators behind the scenes, hey, make sure you glaze up Adesanya so he thinks he got robbed versus Blachowicz. So it's no surprise here. I think Adesanya is the biggest name at middleweight, and the UFC obviously want him to be champion. So if they could pick anybody to be champion at middleweight, it would be Israel Adesanya. But we move on to light heavyweight, and this one is kind of there by default. Alex Pereira, he's the biggest name at light heavyweight right now. He's the most exciting guy at light heavyweight right now. There's really nobody else. Maybe Yuri Prochazka can take his spot, but I think the UFC would rather put their chips behind Alex Pereira. The kickboxing background, the style, the KOs, his fights versus Adesanya, they really clearly put Alex Pereira ahead of anybody else at light heavyweight. His fan base is already pretty strong, and he already is champion. The UFC gets what they want all the time, and they wanted Alex Pereira to be champion light heavyweight. They wanted that potential rematch between Israel Adesanya and Alex Pereira, but it turns out Sean Strickland ruined all of their plans for that. So this one I think is pretty simple. They want Pereira to be champion. There simply is nobody else. Magomed Ankalaev, hell no. The UFC has pretty much proven to us that they don't want Ankalaev to ever have a shot at the belt, let alone be the champion. So Alex Pereira is here pretty much, I wouldn't say by default, but they definitely have pushed him and given him kind of a similar treatment to Sean O'Malley here. Let's be honest. They kind of made sure that Alex Pereira got his way to the belt very efficiently. They gave him good matchups that he could win. Not many grapplers fought Alex Pereira. I think during his time going up the rankings, I think he fought maybe one grappler, and that was his debut fight. But other than that, Alex Pereira has had a pretty favorable uprising to be champion in the UFC. Now, moving on to heavyweight, this one I think is very, very apparent as well. They want to keep Jon Jones as champion. This one is pretty much probably the easiest one on this list besides Conor McGregor. The UFC is doing everything in their power, Dana White especially. There's been several interviews, post-fight speeches by Dana White, pretty much calling Jon Jones the greatest of all time, and they want to preserve that. Preserving Jon Jones's greatness is great for the UFC. It's great for business. As long as the UFC can have somebody who can be claimed as the current GOAT, they're going to do everything in their power to make sure that they're treated well. I'm telling you, there's an important reason why Jon Jones is not fighting Tom Aspinall. If the UFC wanted to make Jon Jones fight Tom Aspinall, it would happen. But since they like Jon Jones so much, they're not going to make that matchup out of respect for keeping Jon Jones the greatest of all time. And once Jon Jones retires, there's going to be that next guy who they want to claim as the GOAT. It was Kamaru Usman in the past. It was Israel Adesanya in the past. but they're going to have to find a new guy most likely to replace Jon Jones as the next guy who can be argued for the GOAT. My bet would be Islam Makhachev, but it could be anybody else. But my whole point that I'm trying to say here is that the UFC at all times are going to have a certain fighter who can contend for GOAT status, whether that's in a weight class specifically or it's the overarching realm of the UFC. If they can compete for the GOAT of either the UFC or their certain weight class, they're going to put all their chips behind them because that is the best marketing possible. If you can market a GOAT in your sport, that's going to bring more eyeballs and more attention. And Jon Jones, of course, he currently holds in the UFC's eyes GOAT status. So they're going to try to preserve that and make sure he maintains that GOAT status. And by keeping him champion, he will always maintain that. That's just simply how it's going to be. In 50 years from now, we're not going to be talking about how he was ducking Tom Aspinall. We're going to be talking about how he was the GOAT of the sport. Even if I disagree with that, the new generation will probably always refer to Jon Jones as the GOAT. It just is what it is. That's what they're going to do. So there you guys go. That is it. That was if the UFC could handpick anybody to be champion of a certain weight class, which fighter would it be? I went through all, 8 weight classes for you guys. Let me know your opinion in the comment section down below. Let me know if you disagree or even agree with my picks. But that is pretty much it. Like, subscribe, hit that bell icon for notifications. I'll see y'all later. Peace.